Okay, even though I didn't hear anybody working with evolution, evolution is pretty cool, I find. So, since at least some of you said yes, we do this anyway. So, we'll see how, if it becomes too long, I will cut it short so you don't have to sit there all evening. Now, to wake you up again, evolution, what do you need to get evolutionary changes in a trait? How does evolution come about?
Diversity.
Yes.
Huh? Variation in a population, and then selective pressure based on that variation, right?
Yeah.
And then inheritance into the next generation.
Yes.
The great postulate.
Yeah, so diversity or genetic variation. You need a selection pressure. This is a much better pen. I think you can see this better, can you?
Yeah.
You need a selection pressure which acts on genetic variation, which needs to be, and you need, the trait needs to be heritable, so it can be passed on. The changes in the variation that's induced by the selection pressure is passed on to the next generation. Right? So you need a, this is often the selection pressure, this is usually variation, additive genetic variation, and heritability. Okay, now selection pressure comes from the environment, right? Whatever is around us. But again, you guys are my environment, and I'm your environment. So other individuals can also be your environment, right? Which means that population, dynamics of a population influences what selection pressures you get. Now, what happens with the population in terms of their dynamics, of course, influences the genetic variation that you're there. If everybody dies, or if two guys end up on a remote island where there haven't been any humans before, or let's say mice or something, you know, you get this very small genetic variation because there are few individuals. You can also get it for other reasons, so you're inbred basically. But population dynamics also influences genetic variation. And all kinds of other things affect it as well. Okay, just a little wake up about what evolution is about. So I'll talk about how you can model evolution. 4 different types of common modeling approaches to model evolutionary changes. And then I'll turn into something that's more closely related to the Baltic, is the fact that fishing might induce evolution in the stocks that you exploit, that you fish. Why does that occur, and are there any examples? And then I'll give you 2 examples of how you can model those particular questions of whether and how fishing induces evolutionary changes. And then we can have a short discussion on which one do you want to use and why. Well, the take-home message of this talk, as I wish it to be for the whole course, is that choosing the right model, so the course goes like this, cross-out evolution. Choosing the right model depends on your research question. So there's no supermodel or panacea that can answer everything. Don't ever believe that, if anyone says that. The right model depends on your question. Okay, so the 4 types of evolutionary models I'll talk about are optimization models, quantitative genetic models, adaptive dynamic models, and something that they've termed eco-genetic models. You'll get all my slides at PDF, so you don't have to take notes unless that keeps you awake. Okay, so the first type of model are optimization models. So by the name, you can hear that the way to go about it is to say that look at what optimizes fitness. Whatever has the highest fitness, that's where the evolutionary endpoint will be. So fitness here, so they maximize fitness. So fitness is often the lifetime reproductive success here, which is the sum of your age-dependent, or whatever X is here, or individuals' fecundity and their survival. And that sums up to 1 in a stable population. And if it exceeds 1, that's something that the evolution would move towards. Now, if you have, this is an example that might be a little bit tricky, but you can think of it as two traits, two aspects of two traits, and the color here is this lifetime reproductive success, the value of it. So the reddest value is the highest R0, R0, highest reproductive, lifetime reproductive success. So that's down here. So that's what you would find with an optimization model. That would say that the evolution would end up here in this trait space. Now, the thing is that if you only optimize and you express fitness like this, you ignore any type of frequency-dependent selection. So any type of selection that depends, where the selection pressure depends on whoever is around you and their traits. So if you account for frequency-dependent selection, the result is actually up here. And that's done with adaptive dynamic models. I'll show you that right now. So it's simple, it's often analytically tractable. You can write down it, you can express it, but you might not account for all types of selection pressures and therefore end up wrong. So if there is frequency-dependent selection going around, you don't want to use optimization models. Another approach are quantitative genetic models. So they basically use this scheme very explicitly. It's in something that's called the breeder's equation, where the response in your trait depends on the strength of the selection pressure and how heritable this trait is. And the heritability of the trait is the amount of additive genetic variation in relation to the phenotypic variation. If you have more complex traits that are functions, it looks a little bit different. But in the way you read it in the books when you took your basic evolution course in biology, it probably looked like this. So here you assume sexual reproduction, and there's always many genes. There's additive genetic variation, and you need values for heritability to model this, right? So what the assumptions that they're doing is that they're assuming that selection is often weak, and that mating is random, such that you always have this normal distributed genetic variation. So you don't distort that distribution. It's not inherent in the approach, but it's sort of common practice. They often assume the fitness values rather than derive it from the environment and the population feedbacks. Which means that if they do that, they also, just like the optimization models, ignore frequency-dependent selection. So if you aren't familiar to frequency-dependent selection, basically as soon as you have population dynamics influencing the selection pressures on the trait, you will have frequency-dependent selection. In most of the cases. Okay, so here's one approach that actually accounts for that. That's why it was developed. They really want to derive fitness as a function of the ecological dynamics. So they're saying that, evolution doesn't happen independently of the ecology that's going on there, but the dynamics, ecological dynamics, influences the evolutionary processes. So they derive the fitness and the selection pressures as a function of the ecological dynamics. But since you can't model everything at once, you have to reduce some complexity. So what it does is that it completely ignores the genetics. So in one sense, it's the opposite of the quantitative genetics approach. So they assume that everything reproduces asexually, not fun, but still, and therefore all the genetic variation comes from mutations. Their equation looks very similar to the more complicated versions of the breeder's function, but they have a population density term here, and how that depends on the trait under evolution. And they have a mutation rate, which is a mu. Okay, so of course this thing with the sexual reproduction and that all genetic variation comes from mutations is quite a weakness. But one particular weakness, except for that it doesn't apply to most of us, is that you can't really model evolutionary responses in short time. Well, you can, but you can't really trust them. And the long term, to see directions, in which direction this trait is going, is fine. But short-term evolutionary responses will depend on the genetic variation that you have in your population. What happens tomorrow or in 2 generations' time, of course, depends on the trait sets that we have, say, in this population, in this room. Okay, so short time period evolution is rarely limited by mutation, but rather by the genetic variation that you have in the population. But the benefit is that they account for ecological dynamics. Okay, so here's panacea. No, there was no panacea, right? So there's no supermodel. But here's an approach that they call the ecogenetic models, which try to account for both the population dynamic and how that creates selection pressures, and assume sexual reproduction and quantitative genetic. So it tries to do a lot. And therefore, they're usually implemented as individual-based models. And therefore, they're very big and complex and take a lot of parameters and a lot of computational, very computational demanding. But they basically try to model not only the mating and the inheritance and the expression of the trait as phenotypes, but all the ecological processes that affects growth and maturation and reproduction and mortality. So, everything. But demanding and parameter-rich models are not only computationally demanding, they might also be hard to understand when you don't know the impact of when you vary 3 parameters at the same time. Okay, so those are the 4 types of common approaches. Now, let's move to a little bit closer to the Baltic Sea, except that this is probably Kattegat picture, but anyway, evolutionary effects of fishing. So what does fishing do? Well, we fish a lot, and we don't fish at random. So this picture, many of you probably see. This is the FAO, State of the World Fisheries thing, where you look at how all the stocks in the world for which there are stock assessments, which level of exploitation are they. So there's an increasing, or was an increasing up until a point here, proportion of overexploited, depleted, or recovering stock. Or even if you add all the fully exploited stocks, there's a high exploitation pressure for most stocks of the world. So we're fishing a lot, and we're preferably fishing large individuals and fast-growing individuals, because 2 individuals of the same age but of different size, of course the bigger one get caught in the net often. Sometimes we're also, or very often, we are fishing in a certain area. Used to be spawning grounds, for example, off Norway, Norwegian cod spawning grounds, and we're actually fishing for fish with a particular behavior. Really smart fish that actually can avoid a trawl. Don't know if you've ever seen those type of cool underwater pictures. They won't get caught, of course. That means that fishing pressure is a selection pressure. High mortality and very particular mortality for certain types of traits. Now, this is basically what we had here, right? Just a crash course in evolution. So you have some variation. You have green guys and blue guys. You fish out the big blue guys. You get a parental generation that has fewer blue guys. So this is the selection part. Now, if color and size wasn't heritable, we wouldn't have any evolutionary change, right? So we needed the heritability. Now, if it's heritable, the proportion of blue eggs and green eggs, who are going to be large or small, is different from what it was before selection. So it's passed on, the same proportions here as here, with some mutation there as well. That means, of course, that the offspring population will be passed on, this proportion of large and small. So we altered the frequency of the traits between generations, and that's what's adaptation or trait evolution. If we continue fishing like this, we will, of course, in the future only have the small green fish left. So that is the fishing effect. So the question is then, are the traits that are affected by fishing heritable? Do we know that? Otherwise, we can just don't care about it. Well, one thing is the fast growth, body growth rate. So the blue things here are the traits. Now, the little statement here is what you would do if you were, that's a surviving strategy. Now, of course, adaptation and evolution aren't conscious processes at all. But if you want to express it like what to do to survive, this is what you would do. So grow slow, not to be caught. So body size, or body growth rate rather, is a trait that's affected by the fishing practices. Is that heritable? Yes, it is. These studies have shown a heritability between 0.2 and 0.6. Another thing is size at maturation. So if you're reproducing at a very large size for your first time maturing, of course you risk of having no offspring at all. So there's a selection pressure for reproducing or maturing at a very small size, and in particular at a young age, to make sure to get offspring before you're caught. That's also heritable, with quite high heritability for some stocks. Other things that we talked about as whether you should move back to a spawning ground that's fished, we don't know the heritability, and neither do we know any about heritability of swimming behavior, for example, or avoidance behavior. But some traits are heritable, so we could expect some evolution going on there. So the question is, does evolution then happen in wild populations, like exploited populations, or does it only happen in lab? Now, here's a wild population that was moved into the lab and then was harvested. So if you harvest small individuals, after 4 generations, they had a much higher growth rate, because then the harvesting pressure is on the small ones. So the surviving strategy is, of course, then to grow fast, to get out of the window of sizes on which you're harvested. And the opposite happens if you harvest large individuals, like in fisheries, right? Then you should retard your growth rate to avoid being caught. And that's actually what happened with these silver sites in the lab of Conver. You don't have evolutionary experiments on harvesting effects in the wild, other than the commercial fishing that we're actually doing, but that's not a controlled experiment. But what there are experiments on the effect of predation on guppies in Trinidad, I believe it was, by Dave Resnick, and he moved around predators that had different size preferences between streams with guppies in, and looked at the effect. And basically what you see is that if you had a predator that went for the large individuals, that are the red bars, and contrasted the response in size at maturation to when you had predators that went for the small ones. Okay, so if you had in the streams where you had predation on the large individuals, you actually saw a relative change or a lower size at maturation than in the streams where they were predated on small between generations. So that also seems to occur evolution in wild populations in the wild. Okay, so we are imposing a selection pressure on traits that are heritable, and it seemed to be occurring evolution in the wild. And in only 4 generations. So that is the question. Is this a fast process? Well, this example, the silver sites were 4 to 10 generations. You had significant differences in the trait. That's really fast if you think of wild populations. And in some of this guppy experiments, you can see as fast responses in the natural streams as you could see in the lab, right? So it can also be fast. So now is the question, does this occur in fish populations? Now, there's one tricky thing, of course, is that if we start fishing a population, it will change because the environment has changed. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's an evolutionary change, right? Because if it's not passed on to the next generation, it's not a genetic change. It might only be a plastic response. Just the fact that we're fishing out individuals means that there's more food left for the guys that did survive. More food means, of course, an increased body growth. Remember the previous talk, right? Less competition, more resources, you grow faster. And if you have a particular size at which you mature, you of course reach that faster if you grow faster. So you can get an earlier maturation just from a plastic response to fishing. Now, there might be evolution changes, and they might be there at the same time. Because if you increase the mortality, we have this selection pressure. You might have this change in the traits that has to do with maturation, such as size at maturation, and they were heritable, as we saw before. So that might also lead to an early maturation at a smaller size. So the question is how to disentangle these. Now, Mikko Heino developed a method that it was called probable maturation reaction norms. I won't show any questions or details, but the idea is basically that you filter out any type of variation in body growth that comes from environmental changes or that comes from demographic changes. So the fact that you have fished away all the large individuals and surviving. And whatever remains then, if you look at trends over time, if you remove the effects of environmental variation and demographic structure, what remains might be evolutionary changes. That's the idea behind it. And this approach then enabled a lot of analysis of wild fish populations. And here we have the Canadian cod, you know, the famous one that crashed in '92, and when there was the fishing moratorium. And Espen Olsen made a probabilistic reaction norm analysis. So you looked at the length, basically length at maturation, once you filtered out all these effects. And he really saw this decrease when you had this intensive fishery. It's almost a half, right? From 60s to 30. And when you stop fishing, he started to see an increase again in this. And these type of plots has been taken as an indication of that there might be evolutionary changes going on in fish populations. This has been done and shown for a whole range of species, for a whole range of stocks. Earlier maturation at the smaller size, using this probabilistic maturation reaction norm method. It's also, luckily I would say, otherwise you start becoming suspicious, it's also been applied and found not to be found any evolutionary changes in one particular population where it was tested. All of these examples are in this science paper that is part of the readings that was sent out a short while ago. Okay, so there seems to be something going on in fish populations. Now, does that matter? Except for that we want everything to be like it was, that it always been. Well, it matters for yields, of course. If individuals in your stock mature at a smaller size, they won't grow as large as if they mature at a larger size, right? Because growth rate levels off after maturation. So your total biomass of yields would go down. They also saw that in this experiments on the silver side in the lab. Your yields go down. Another thing is, of course, that, well, we were talking about skinny cod in the break. A small individual often don't render as high price as a big individual per kilo. So profitability of your fishery might go down. And body size mattered, right? The whole previous talk was on how body size mattered for ecological dynamics. So if you start inducing evolutionary changes in size of maturation, which in turn affects body size in general, your whole ecological dynamics might be different, both at the population level and then the species level, or species interactions. And as soon as you're here and starting to affect population growth rate, well, of course, that also affects whether these stock can recover from overexploitation. Sorry. Here's a model study of where Katja Enberg in Bergen compared the recovery rate after fishing in a model where you ignored evolutionary changes or in a model where you actually included it. So this is an ecogenetic model. And what you saw is that whereas an ecological model, they can, oh sorry, you don't have any values here. One is here, sorry. So this is relative biomass, so this is before fishing, then they start fishing, and then they stop fishing, and they look at recovery. Now, the ecological model that ignores evolution would tell you that, yes, your stock can fully recover to the same level as it was before fishing. No worries. Whereas, because of the evolutionary changes in size at maturation, if you account for these, your stock might not recover at all, or at least not in this studied time period. So it does matter for population recovery. So just to sum that up, before maybe we skip the model examples, we'll see how we feel. So fisheries-induced evolution in traits can occur in wild populations. Evolutionary trait changes can occur in the wild. They can be fast, and they affect yield and recovery potential. So it really does matter for exploited stocks. And well, depends on if you believe this probabilistic reaction norm, all these studies, but what they indicate is, if you believe the method, that it might well have been caused by fishing in very many stocks. It can only be reduced by fishing less. Now, so how do you model this then? Do you remember, we talked about these 4 approaches to model: quantitative, genetics, model, optimization models, adaptive dynamics models, and ecogenetic models. Right? So the first ones, they are pretty simple, but they don't account for density and frequency dependent selection, and they can't predict the rate of evolution. Speeds. Quantitative genetic models are fairly simple. They, by practice, often doesn't account by frequency selection. That's probably my phone, sorry for that. But they can predict evolutionary rates. Adaptive dynamic models, they're quite flexible. They can account for density dependent and frequency dependent selection, but they can't predict the evolutionary rates. And then we have these super big models, ecogenetic models. The positive way of saying it is that they are flexible, meaning that they're sort of complex. They account for frequency dependent selection, and they can predict the evolutionary rates. So I'll give you 2 examples. Yeah, we have 10 minutes. I do that. One of the ecogenetic models, I'll start with that, and then one of the adaptive dynamics models, where it's been applied to this question of fishing-induced evolutionary change. So the first thing was this model where you wasn't really sure what it was good for. Then that was the model of the Northeast Arctic cod by Katja Enberg, where she looked at recovery rate in following hard fishing when you accounted for the evolutionary changes in size at maturation. Not only size at maturation, but also fecundity and growth rate. And then, since it was this ecogenetic model, she was assuming that you had sexual reproduction and variation in the trait, genetic variation in the trait, and she also accounted for this feedback from population on the trait evolution. So what she saw then, the black one again is the model that accounts for evolution, and the gray one is the model that ignores the evolution. So she fished it, and then she saw what the recovery rate was following fishing. So this is the year after seizure of fishing. And you see a pretty fast recovery in the ecological model, the light gray thing here. But what you see in the model that accounts for evolution is that it has for sure not recovered after 100 years. It actually hasn't come up to the same biomass level as it used to be until after almost 1,000 years. And the reason is that your trait hasn't recovered until a very long time. It takes over almost 3,000 years for it to recover to where it used to be before fishing. So that's the type of things. You can look at rates, for example, of recovery, which you can't do with other models. Now, since these are so complex, these models, I haven't seen any models that have more than 1 species in them. So they account for population feedback from the own population, but they don't account for any impact of other species. So in another study, together with Ulf Diekman, that only published in my thesis, that's why it says there, we looked at the effect of fishing in 2 competing populations. And again, you have these, they are continuously, well, they're size structured, both of them can have any size, and they compete for resources. And we then did this with adaptive dynamics models. So these is a type of model that is very limited in the sense that it assumes that these guys reproduce asexually, right? So applying that to fishing-induced evolution can't say anything about evolutionary rates or recovery rates or anything. It can only say whether your trait will go up or down, or the end directions and endpoints. Okay? So what that showed was when you model over time the relative change in size at maturation, it was strongly impacted by the scenario for competition that you had. So if you had a single species model, in this particular case, your size at maturation actually increased because I was fishing at these intermediate sizes. And if you had weak competition from a competitor that was so superior that these evolving guys, they had no effect on these ones, you would assume that you have an even stronger effect. So you would have an additive effect. But if you account for competition where both competitors affect each other, you instead have the quite opposite pattern. So when you account for the feedbacks that there are in a competition system, you get a completely opposite response in size at maturation than you would have got in the single species if you ignored the feedbacks. So these type of things, you can't, well, I guess you can in the future, but I haven't seen it done in an ecogenetic model because they are so complex. On the other hand, we can't use the rates here for anything in this type of model. We can only use it as, it will go up or down or stay the same. Yep. Okay, so if you ever go into modeling evolution, which of all these 4 models would you use? Well, again then, that depends on your question, right? So that's the whole take-home message for the whole course, from everything. Choose an appropriate model for your question. Okay.
It will be an easy summary for us.
Pardon?
It will be an easy summary for us.
Okay, so for evolution, you need genetic variation and a selection pressure acting on that, and the traits need to be heritable. But don't forget that there's feedback in the system, right? The traits that evolve will affect the population dynamics that come out, and the population dynamics actually result in selection pressures, and selection pressures affect the evolution. So you have this nice feedback between ecological and evolutionary dynamics, and population dynamics is of course influenced by other species as well, right? Like we talked about before. So you might have evolutionary responses affected by, for example, a competitor, like we said before. You've got completely different responses when you accounted for competition than when you ignored it. Okay, and we have these 4 modeling approaches, but whatever to use, there's no panacea, there's no best model. There never is the best model for anything. There are just pet models of senior researchers or younger researchers. So always pick an appropriate model for your question. That was it. Thanks. This is what I like to do.